Thank you all for joining us today. I am really looking forward to sharing this particular topic with you all. I have worked with attorneys in legal settings as a social worker now approaching 20 years. And I've noticed that before issues of trauma-informed services are center stage, there are also issues of mental health that consistently pop up for our attorneys that we work with in various settings. So I hope to share some of what I've learned and impart some resources and just some rules of thumb, some tools for your toolkit, so that hopefully you can approach your career with some resources to support the work, the very important work that you all do. So I'm going to go ahead and begin the presentation. So today we're going to be talking about lawyering and mental health, in particular, the factors that are impacting the work and strategies for caring for ourselves in the process. And starting out, I'd like you guys to perhaps close your eyes. We're going to start with just a little simple breathing. I know this topic can come during your lunch hour. You've already been sitting in front of the computer. And I am removing my face as a distraction. The title will be on the screen, but feel free to close your eyes for just a moment. And, you know, breathing is so simple, but it's also an indicator of when maybe our bodies are not regulated. And for many of you, you work in settings where it is very adrenaline impacted. So you're working with clients who might be in crisis. You yourself might be juggling various things in your life in addition to your caseloads. And just the court environment and legal process can get the blood pumping in particular situations. So it's always good to start off with a little bit of awareness. And sometimes we aren't aware. So the first thing I'd like you all to do is put one hand on your chest, put another hand on your abdomen, and just take a moment to feel your heart rate and listen to my voice. I'll be slowing down just a bit. And we're going to practice breathing 4 breaths in through our nose, holding it for a couple of seconds, and breathing out for 4 counts. And we're going to do that 3 times before we begin this topic. All right, so let's go ahead and take 1 breath in through our nose. Hold for 2 counts and slowly feel the air as you exhale from your abdomen. And do it again. And one last time. And just hang your head down low. Let your chin touch your chest. And roll your neck to the right, all the way around. Very slowly. And now in the opposite direction. And this might seem counterintuitive after all that relaxation, but shake out your hands. Just go ahead and shake them out. Get some blood pumping. Just a little bit, get the circulation going. Now, this is a simple way to regulate. If at any point during this presentation you feel you need to take a pause, feel free to notice your breath and then continue with some breaths and then proceed to engage with the material. So without further ado, we're going to start. I'm going to start out sharing a little bit about Los Angeles Center for Law and Justice. We are a nonprofit law firm. We were founded in 1973. We presently serve all of LA County, which is a pretty large area. And we center a lot of our work in family and immigration law. We are very committed to working with survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. And we're really committed to centering the voice of survivors so that they can empower themselves to create their own future. And for many of you, you're probably already aware, but October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so I'll make another announcement at the end, but just something to keep in mind for those of you that are working with survivors. This work is particularly impactful, but can require you to really take care of yourself. So we're going to start off today by defining mental health, what it could look like, exploring the intersection between mental health and lawyering, identifying some of the challenges many of you face with regard to mental health in general, and then hopefully discussing some of the resiliency strategies that are available to you. So when thinking about mental health, it usually helps to have a working definition. And, you know, there is a lot of stigma, but really I hope to break some of that down, because throughout our lives, we are going to encounter stressors. We will experience trauma, but it can impact our emotional, psychological, and social well-being in different ways. And it's really good to realize that, you know, it can be, some aspects of mental health can be static, but many can be fluid. And we can really focus on those areas where we have some say and some impact on how we proceed with dealing with our own mental health and needs. So it does affect how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. Many of you might have heard of cognitive behavioral therapy. Largely CBT, as it's known, deals with this triangle of thought, feeling, and consequent behavior. It also determines how we handle our stress, how we relate to one another, and it can also relate to how we make healthy choices. So I will mention when we start discussing a little bit about coping, some of those previously held thoughts around what is healthy coping, what's not healthy. You'll notice that I am very much aligned with a harm reduction model, because I believe that many people, including ourselves as professionals, we need to start where we're at and getting help and support where we need it. When we discuss serious mental illness, however, we are talking about somebody over the age of 18, having within the past year, so timeframes are really important, a diagnosable mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder within that past year, which resulted in functional impairment that substantially interferes with or limits major life activities. So you could have a bad day, you could have a bad week, but when we're talking about persistent mental illness, we're talking about something that's become more chronic and is affecting those sectors of your life where you need to have a certain level of functionality. All right, so we're going to go on to explore the intersection between mental health and lawyering. And many of you may have already seen this. When we consider competence, the rules of professionalism require strict adherence. Many of you are held to this standard that in order to meet these requirements and to deliver competent services, you yourself must be in mentally healthy condition to discharge your duties. So, you know, there is a California rule of professional conduct. There it is. It's really important for your clients, for those that are relying on you professionally, but we'd also like to very much focus on you. Many of you want to continue to do this work, and you'd like to have long careers doing something that you enjoy, that you love, that brings meaning to your life. But it's important that you be fortified with resources to help you do that work. Why is it important? Here are just a few statistics you may or may not have seen before, that between 21 and 36% of lawyers would qualify as problem drinkers. That tends to be when, you know, various surveys are given. There's a lot of coping strategies around socialization, but it does involve substances, you know, and mainly drinking. I guess that's the preferred method of consuming substances. Lawyers struggle with depression, anxiety, and stress, respectively. So it may not seem like a lot, but usually it's the precursor to other mental health needs down the line. And 20% of attorneys may need clinical intervention. So it may have escalated to the point where it's exceeded kind of your own resources that you usually have available, and requires that you reach outside and seek out clinical intervention. So stress and trauma, like, how does it impact most of us? It can impact cognitive functioning. So some of you may have had different stressful times in your life, have maybe experienced depression or sadness. It could be personal, it could be within your professional sphere, but you'll notice when the brain is firing on all cylinders, even in the best of circumstances, when you have these stressors and traumatic events enter, the cognitive functioning, your cognitive functioning, excuse me, can be impaired. We are wired for that stress response, right? Our body, when it indicates that we're under stress, under fire, we are kicking full of adrenaline. We have neurotransmitters communicating that we are in potential danger. And so we respond in that way. Our body naturally responds. That breathing exercise we did up front at the beginning of this session is just one indicator. If you just put your hand on your heart, you'll notice when you come out of traffic, start just kind of doing it throughout the day to kind of see how you are responding to stress in your environment. And then maybe reflect upon whether or not you function well, given those circumstances. So many of us go into that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. That's a new one where you kind of make it through that section just to get yourself to safety. And it's important to recognize that, because when your brain is engaged in a trauma response or an extreme stress response, your prefrontal cortex, that very important front part of your brain that is last to develop, is the part that makes sense of everything, organizes the information in a linear fashion. However, when you're under stress and experiencing trauma, it goes offline. And your primitive part of your brain that reacts and responds is what kicks in. So it's important to realize and recognize how you yourself respond. Physical health can take a dramatic dive during this time. Many of you may have noticed when you're under extreme stress at work or in life that you may catch cold more frequently. Your immune system is not able to fend off things in your environment, and you get sick or you get run down. You might find yourself sleeping more. There are certain things that physically occur, and long-term, we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. It can have an impact. And mental health, right? So one day, one event, one occurrence, if not that dramatic, if not that impactful for multiple reasons, we'll talk about protective factors in a moment, you may be able to bounce back rather quickly. But if exposed over an amount of time, a longer period of time, or a more dramatic event, could impact and take a toll on all of your personal and external resources and result in some mental health issues emerging. And so it's really good to know what your baseline is. Where are you usually? Are you somebody that gets affected by seasonal changes? Are you somebody that can handle calls from a friend when they're stressed, but not during like a court case? Say you're really stressed during that time. That would not be a good time to maybe return the call. Over a long period of time, you might notice that you remember yourself functioning better or being happier, but now you find that you're not quite yourself any longer. So these are good things to pay attention to. Another thing that's really important is to recognize, that there is stigma around mental health. I know that there have been many campaigns trying to break it down. And really what I want to say to you, what I really want the takeaway to be, is that our brains are designed in such a way that some of these responses are normal responses to abnormal circumstances, right? We're designed to bounce back. It's when we're not bouncing back that we have to recognize it and know where to go for help. So we talked a little bit about the physical. I want to focus on that a little bit, and that you might have indicators that your body is cueing you to, right? If you have mental and emotional stress, it can manifest over time because you are bracing your body, right? Whenever you feel stress, that tension, right, builds up, and you might notice it on the base of your neck. You might find a lack of circulation. Maybe all of your blood is rushing to your major internal organs and you start feeling cold. You might notice rapid breath, right? Shallow breathing, rapid breath, a tight diaphragm. Over time, that can have impact to your overall systemic structure, right? If you're doing that, the strong tension at the base of the skull and spine, where we're talking about migraines, sometimes showing up. You notice that when you're under a lot of tension, you're starting to notice migraines. And I mentioned the cold hands and feet. So what this can mean over the long term is cardiovascular disease, immune disorders, and something that's reported with great frequency are sleep disorders, just not being able to get to sleep or to stay asleep. Both are equally important. So I wanted to thank many of you that took the time to fill out the survey ahead of this training, because some of you did mention that trauma is a real concern to you, being exposed, right, to vicarious trauma. And what it is when we speak of vicarious trauma is the cumulative negative effect of caring about and for others. So it's a good thing, right? So I've heard many attorneys say, I compartmentalize. But the issue with that also is the lack of empathic engagement. So for those of you that have been doing this work for a while, you will probably find that when you're able to empathize with your client, right, not take on their symptoms, if you will, but recognize their symptoms and respond in a different way, right, that minimizes your exposure to those effects. Now, it does transform you, right? You can never unhear, unsee, unlearn things that you've been exposed to. But with regard to trauma and your client's traumatic experience. But what you can do is develop some resiliency strategies and factors. And it's probably not good for the long term to compartmentalize, but I was really pleased to see that many of you mentioned boundaries, and you recognize the need for boundaries in order to help balance the empathic engagement. Right? So that can look like not taking calls after a certain hour, communicating very clearly, not just with your clients, but also with your supervisors about what boundaries can exist within your workplace. So many legal settings are not crisis centers, so you don't have 24-hour staff. So what might that look like for your client who's in crisis? So it might mean developing their safety plan, a network, a call list, making sure that they know who to call after hours when you are not available, when you should not be available. And when I say should not, I mainly mean that for many of us in legal settings, we're not set up with staff and support after hours. And if that is the case, and you are working after hours, what supports need to be developed so that you have those resources for your clients when you are not available, okay? It may also mean that you take on realistic responsibilities with regard to your clients. So I know sometimes when our clients are children, we want to be there 24/7. And I sometimes ask the attorney, how are you going to sustain that? Because realistically, this client, once the case is over, will go about their life. So really, it might do us more good, and it might serve the client better if we help them develop those resources that they can sustain. Okay, so how do we identify these challenges to our mental health? So the first thing is to notice when you're experiencing some of these. So these are, when we talked about functionality, when we talked about whether or not somebody's just having like a one-time or a hard week or something that's transitory in your life, but it's not persistent, it's not really impacting your functioning over time. But here are some clues that maybe it is. So if there is a prolonged period of time, and we're really considering like a year, right? You don't want to get to that point without recognizing some of these signs. So hypervigilance is one. If you have seen documentation, photos, listened to threats given to your clients, if you've seen pictures, all of these things can result in a traumatic response. You may not have physically been there, but you have heard it experienced from the lens of your client's perspective. And you may be thinking about it. And to the point where I've heard attorneys that hear the car backfire or hear something, you know, through the open window in the middle of the night, and it causes a startle response and a certain degree of hypervigilance, right? Where you don't feel safe in your surroundings. I've had attorneys say to me that sometimes they have to go to a park and watch children play, or go to a dinner party, or hang out with couples that are relating in a healthy manner, to remind themselves that, you know, the work that they do is very important, but to balance it with other images and other situations that are healthier, right? So that's not all you're seeing. Intrusive thoughts. So if you find yourself wandering and perseverating, really getting stuck on certain images or thoughts, that can be an indication. Mood alterations. Do you find yourself being short, depressed more often? Do you also find yourself feeling anxious? Do you see your heart racing? Do you notice that it's harder, that you have some kind of physical response, like an anxious response, when you get certain types of cases? Or say you just have a heavy caseload, right? And it seems that everybody has a really challenging time, right? There's no gradient to it. It's all blurring and it all feels like you're filled with anxiety or depression. It's a good thing to notice. Avoidance. Are you avoiding things? Are you trying to avoid sensory input of some degree, whether it's loud noises, too much light, you feel overwhelmed and panicked. So you start avoiding particular situations, circumstances, aspects of your case when you're working on it. Do you find that it's harder to get through reading a case study? Are there changes to your sleep patterns? Do you notice you're waking frequently through the night? Do you not sleep for hours? Are you getting 2 or 3 hours of sleep a night? You know, we are very much part of a grind society, right? And I've noticed very much so in mental health as well, for clinicians as well as attorneys, billable hours, right? Client contact notes. How much time are you spending on a case? Are you preparing for court? Are you preparing for something coming up that's very important for the client, right? They have to get so much done before a certain amount of time to really put themselves in an advantageous position for their next hearing. Are they going to mediation? Whatever the case may be, I notice that there's still a grind culture. And really, it's important that we start thinking about rest. Right? Why do so many of us burn out doing this work? Why is it hard to get people to stay working in legal aid, and even with support of social workers and other admin staff and other legal, you know, support networks? Why is it so difficult? It's because of this, you know, in part because we're grinding things out. And I know there are deadlines, but perhaps rethinking how we approach it. Think about teams, think about assignments, think about maybe just having one day where you guys work on your notes and you work on your research, but you're not having direct client contact one day a week. Is that possible? I think it's time to start thinking about the possibilities, because we're seeing things that are essential to our well-being and mental health, such as sleep being impacted. Loss of appetite or what you eat. I've heard so many attorneys tell me that, oh my God, I had the best of intentions to eat healthy this week, but I find myself going through the drive-through. Now, working at home, one of the blessings many people have said when they have a hybrid or work at home situation is they learn to start meal planning for the week. And that allowed them to have healthier foods as part of their diet to help with their immunity, to help with their brain functioning, to get those omegas, right? Fewer fried foods, things of that nature, right? But loss of appetite, none of this planning will do well if you're depressed and you're losing appetite. So please notice if you're rapidly gaining or losing weight, that could also be an indicator. Difficulty with relationships. Do your children tell you that you're mean? Does your spouse or your partner or your significant other, even, your close friends, are they telling you like you haven't been yourself lately, right? Do you find some of these relationships dissolving? It's a good indicator that maybe something's going on, right? That we need to pay attention to. The decrease in physical activity, it's really important, so we did this exercise sitting. Many of you could do it standing. I keep a yoga mat in my room, my work office. I have a standing desk. I even have a balance ball. If you can change your body position, if you can move a little, if you can take your breaks, do little walks around the house, try to get your 10,000 steps in, get your Fitbits or your iPhones. Various apps have this where it'll buzz you when you've been sitting too long. Really, really, really try to do this because it gets the blood pumping to the brain, gets your heart going in all the right ways, right? So let's think about that. And then hygiene. Something I laugh only because at the start of the pandemic, one of the first things, excuse me, that I heard about was this idea of shifting to loungewear, right? So it's one thing to have the messy bun. It's one thing, if you're not having any work meetings that day, you're not going to be on Zoom, to maybe not be dressed to the T and be courtroom ready. But when basic hygiene starts to slip, it might also be a very important indicator that you might want to check in with yourself or somebody else. All right. So for those of you that indicated you were curious about how to respond to vicarious trauma, I think it's really important to realize what goes into it. So when we talk about vicarious trauma, there are a lot of self-tests around trauma. There's a lot around STS, secondary traumatic stress, burnout. Burnout in general can occur in any career where maybe you experience stagnation. You've been doing the same thing too long. You start feeling ineffective. Like I've been doing this and all these people, it's like a drop in the bucket. You start feeling like you're not professionally challenged. All those things can lead to burnout. Countertransference goes back to that empathic engagement. Are you over relating with your clients, right? So many of us come into this work and, I say we're born out of blood, meaning we were born into families where some of these issues arise, and that's why we want to do this work. Others are born out of heart, meaning that you were touched in working with or being exposed to people, members of society that might be under-resourced or overstressed or really just having a rough go of it. And you're becoming aware that, not everybody is dealing with the same thing in the same way, right? But for those of us that have been doing this work for a while, we're bound to encounter somebody or something that triggers something in us. And we start having this over-identification with our client or the circumstance. And this, again, is like the opposite of compartmentalization, right? So we're not like putting it aside or recognizing, oh, yes, this person reminds me of so-and-so, or this feels like it's too close to home. I'm going to be aware of that, right? And really stay centered on where the client's at. So the first thing that you're going to need to do is recognize it in yourself. And the last thing is compassion satisfaction. So when we're talking about vicarious trauma, most of the measures look at the first three factors that contribute to vicarious trauma. But the last one is very seldom explored. And that's the reason why many of us do this work. So what joy or satisfaction or feeling of just accomplishment, like this is what I want to do with my life. When do we validate this, right? So there are times as we're doing this work that we need to celebrate. So many of us do shout outs at work or success stories or ways that this comes about. One of the reasons why we do this is to remind ourselves of this compassion satisfaction. And it's super important that we acknowledge it as much as we acknowledge the others. It's important to have a balanced view, okay? And one tool that actually takes all four factors into account is the professional quality of life indicator survey. And I'm going to share that with you at the end when we go over resources. But it's a way to check in with yourself, okay? How are you dealing with these factors that lead to vicarious trauma? All right, so it is the pleasure you derive from this work. And it's also something simple as those positive feelings. So early on, we talked about the thoughts, the feelings, and the behaviors, right? Your feelings will largely indicate if you're reactive or responsive or you're taking that moment, but really recognize when you feel positive about helping others. Recently at our organization, and actually several times over the years when I've worked at various places, we have work retreats. And one of the items on our agenda that we frequently go over is, what do we love about, like, why did we come to do this work? What brings us together? And this is often reflected in our organizational cultures, right? So many of us really respect our colleagues. We came to work at the places we're working because we have great respect for our colleagues. They've been fighting the good fight. They come with lots of experience. They come with lots of compassion. They're game changers, right? They're innovative. They're looking at old problems through new lenses and looking at systemic ways of dealing with the same old problems that probably will have greater impact. These are all the reasons why we come to work, and we feel good about the work that we do, right? Our organization's missions and values speak to that. And we'd like to think, I think many of us, that we contribute to the greater good of society. Many of your orgs respond to needs within our communities. And so it's important to look at that, and they need to exist. But if we can't continue doing this work, the question then becomes, who's going to do this work if I don't do this work, right? So we're part of the solution, but we need to make sure that we have our supports. So these are factors that you probably want to look to on a personal and organizational level. So how are you feeling? What are you thinking? Do you have stinking thinking? Is your lens starting to get a bit muddied or clouded? Are you feeling down most of the time? And how are you responding? Are you finding a need, after work, to just go home and pass out? Are you not engaging with your family when you get home? Do you need some entry time? That's fine. But are we totally avoidant and not present? Now, something I'm about to say might be a little controversial, but in the scope of things, and again, I'm coming from a clinician perspective, and I know some of you in this room were formerly clinicians. There's adaptive responses. How are we adapting to our environment? And some of us might cope by drinking, right? And some will say, oh, that's not a healthy response. But when the alternative could be something more destructive or more harmful over time, sometimes I say that, that coping strategy worked, at least for tonight. that person was not suicidal that evening. Now, long-term, can it affect your mood to the point where it's detrimental? Of course it can. But, you know, we talk about adaptive and maladaptive behaviors. And of course, we'd like to replace certain responses that we have and behaviors that we have to stress and trauma with more healthy options, right? So going home, maybe resting 15 minutes and then going for a family walk, even if nobody speaks, you know, until dinner time, you know, whatever it may be, but there's a way to adapt. And so it's important to know that at each place here, whether we're feeling or how we're thinking about it or how we choose to respond, that in that triangle, there are opportunities to have our thoughts change our mindset, change our cognition, recognize how we're feeling, and choose to respond differently, right? Organizationally, you might notice high turnover. Now, this is a little different, I think, in legal aid. I think many of us, you know, we don't get paid big bucks sometimes where we work, when we work in legal aid. And there could be high turnover because, you know, we need to also provide for families, and we have needs, and the cost of living can be high in some of our areas. But it's important to look at high turnover for other reasons. So is there high turnover because people burn out quickly because there aren't enough supports? Or is there low morale and not really a great organizational culture? Does some of that need to be retuned? Are some things working and other things not working? Absenteeism. Are a lot of people getting sick? Are we getting run down? Well, we have the opposite problem, I think, sometimes at our org, where people are working so hard that they're not taking their vacation time. And many of you may have seen, if any of you own timeshares, or a big timeshare pitch usually is, you know, you're actually healthier and you're more productive when you're well rested. And that part is true. I don't know that purchasing the timeshare, if it's not in our budget, would be a great thing, because that might put financial stress on us. But definitely taking vacays, taking days off, even if it's just for a staycation, or if it's for a day where you can just unplug, it's really important to take those days at the front end before it becomes something more chronic. And then job dissatisfaction, that goes back a little bit to that feeling of burnout. You know, are you challenged? Are you working with your supervisor? Are you working with your organization to offer training opportunities, opportunities for professional development, resources being provided through the org? I know some of us might have Kaiser. I'm just going to throw them out. They have wellness programs. Many of your health plans have wellness programs. And so if certain things are not provided for, maybe even taking a look, you know, under that rock and seeing if that helps with overall job satisfaction. So it could be in services, it can be in supports, it can be in structure. We can look under all these rocks and see if perhaps there's something we can put together and look at in a new way. All right, so I want to get into some risk factors. So for those of you that might be feeling stressed or actually have experienced some vicarious trauma, it could be around your client characteristics. Are they trauma survivors? Are there graphic narratives? Is there risk of future victimization? In other words, I can help them this time, but I don't know if it's going to help long term. We see that sometimes with restraining orders, or working with children or immigrants, whether or not there are other stressful situations. And then harm to self and harm to others. You know, this is something that doesn't always come up. We'll get to it when we get to looking at our attorneys. But, you know, working in an integrated model, I see that both the social workers and the attorneys struggle. Many times, you know, the social workers struggle because of our ethical and legal mandates and how we navigate that very gray area of having to maintain, you know, 100% confidentiality in legal settings, and largely our policies, procedures, and protocols at our organization will dictate that. Others solely work at legal aid and don't have this integrated model, but refer out for services. But when it comes up that a client is threatening to harm themselves and others, and you don't have a mandate to report, but you know that it might help your client, I know sometimes that weighs heavily on attorneys. They want to help, and so when your clients present this way, thinking about ways to preemptively address safety concerns, right? And de-escalation comes up. What do I do when my client's in crisis and they're thinking, they're suicidal or homicidal, and I can't say anything, that can pose a stressful issue for many attorneys. And I know it's like, okay, I don't have a legal need to respond to this. Part of why I'm able to help my client is because I have 100% confidentiality, but also your knowledge, you're the holder, you're the vessel of that information. And I just have to say that, I see that many of you struggle with that. So it's important that it be addressed somewhere. Organizational contributions. So you're dealing with clients that may present this way, but you may have many clients that present this way. So organizational contributions can be large caseloads, lack of peer support. So do you have groups like support groups or professional groups that you can access? Lack of supervision, the frequency of supervision, the quality of supervision. Looking at wellness as an agenda item when you meet for supervision could really be a game changer. And then few client resources. So I know at our org, it does help to have social workers there so that the attorneys can focus on lawyering and we can focus on those supportive services that are integrated as part of our legal service model. Personal characteristics. So here's why I want to mention the ACEs. It doesn't often come up. It comes up a lot in social work, but the ACEs were a study conducted by Kaiser. Initially, it was not a very diverse sample. Later on, the study was repeated. And what they found is that many of us have been exposed to one or more incidents of trauma, or we may come from communities that are under-resourced. We may be individuals of color that systemically don't find equal access under the law. Many of us may have become attorneys to try to balance that access to justice, but we need to also consider our own personal victimization history. If you're starting out, you might be green, or you might be just green in a certain area, right, of practice. So you may lack experience. There could be individual trauma and other stressors occurring in your own life, right? And your usual coping skills may not be working any longer. And you may be at the same job for a long time. It's always good to assess professionally if you can grow within the same org, or maybe another area of interest is calling to you within, law. And it's important to check in with yourself periodically. So a professional review would be, indicated there. And then so here's the crux of it. How do we develop resiliency strategies? So one thing is to look at your own personal resources. So your characteristics. Are you an individual that's developed your self-esteem? Are you resourceful? What do you do when you're stressed? How do you go about caring for yourself? Something that's really a strength is your desire and ability to help others, right? So you've been able to do it for others. Chances are you're able to do it for yourself. It's just refocusing a little bit of that energy back on yourself. And whether or not you subscribe to a faith practice or not, research has shown that this is very much a resiliency factor, right? Having some sort of faith or wellness practice has really helped many combat the stressors and trauma indicators that exist in their work. And then opportunities for meaningful actions and activities. Some of us still volunteer outside of work. We have causes and family members and other people that are centered in our lives. And it's important to continue to have a robust and full life outside of ourselves. And so what can you do? You can increase self-observation. So throughout your days, journaling is great. Like, do it for a week, do it for a month, however long you can do it, even if it's for a day. Do it for today. Get off this call, and at the end of the day, check in with your heartbeat. How are you doing at the end of the day? How is your breathing? Are you in a constant state of, tension? Engage in self-care behaviors. Take your breaks. Get off this call and look to see when's the next time you can plan a vacation, even if it's a day. Create a wellness plan. So what does that look like? It looks like looking at the different spheres of your life: spiritual, psychological, your work life. People talk about work-life balance. What are you doing in various areas? Your social life. What are you doing to connect with friends and family? And then use your cognitive abilities, right? What can you think of? What can you read? What can you add to your wheelhouse for caring for yourself? Are you somebody that likes cooking? Are you somebody that likes exercising? Go ahead and see if you can find ways to integrate. I love the outdoors. In my former life, I did a lot in the outdoors. So, in private practice, I engage in ecotherapy. I take people outdoors and conduct therapy outdoors. I think moving and breathing fresh air and integrating the two is really important. And that's just my perspective on that. But find things that work for you. You want to seek out peer support, all right, and engage in behavioral activities at work even. So, and how you respond to stressful situations. Look at your caseloads, discuss it with your supervisor, figure out if there's a day that you can not schedule clients, or maybe for a couple hours throughout the day or the end of your day. Figure out how that works. Maintaining healthy boundaries. As I discussed before, what is allowed at work? What resources do you have? What are you not adhering to right now that maybe you could try doing one more thing to fortify those boundaries, even if it's communicating clearly with your client and making sure that they know where to go when they need help, so that you're not the only go-to. Resiliency trainings. This is kind of a new concept, but it's, join trainings much like this one, that talk about what you can do, how you can check in with yourself, right, before things get out of hand. And then address personal and organizational culture barriers. So, something that I hear about sometimes is when, people of color, join an organization, they're trying to be diverse, but then they're tapped to give the training, right? Sometimes you might have to say, no, I'd like to receive the training. Can we bring somebody else in to discuss this, right? There could be other barriers, right, within the community. Does your organization reflect your community? Does it reflect your values? So, those are strategies we can employ. And then here at the very end, it will be distributed later. If you want to take a little deeper dive into the Kaiser ACE study, ACEs study, take a look at it, okay? And see if you see yourself reflected. You can take a version of the survey yourself to see where you are and on this, and it might be illuminating to see what you're carrying into this work that you do. Also, I noticed a typo here, but a Substance Abuse Health Service Administration, so SAMHSA, we can look at mental health and substance use. Since it is the go-to for many attorneys, I thought it might just, provide some resources and some helpful information to discuss other coping strategies. There's much information on that site. There are two really great books, The Body Keeps Score, for those of you doing work around trauma or even in high stress environments, and you find yourself somaticizing, carrying this with you in your body. It's really great. You might see yourself in some of the stories, and hopefully it will normalize this for you, right? I mean, it does not have to be a stigma that you are seeking out support. And it's always good to approach this from a preventative standpoint. So recognition of it and having tools to measure it for yourself will help. Trauma stewardship, for those of you continuing to do this work and want to sustain in the field that you're in, this is a really great book. And then lastly, ProQual. It is the Professional Quality of Life Indicator survey that I discussed earlier. They also have great handouts on the breathing technique that I did earlier, and they have progressive muscle relaxation. They have a lot of other coping strategies that I would encourage you to explore on their site. So that is it. And if you need to reach me, you can reach me at sylvia@laclj.org. And I just would really like to thank you so much for your attention today. It's really been meaningful to be here. I'm so happy that you all reached out and that so many attended. It speaks very highly of attorneys in general that are doing this work, that they recognize that their own self-care is and should be a priority. So thank you so much.